Chocolate? Chocolate! Chocolate!
Hello everybody, Chocolate Guy here, and welcome back to another countdown. Yes, I'm doing a face reveal. This is the first time on this channel I've appeared in the flesh, on camera, and I'm doing it for a special occasion, and also because I didn't really know how I wanted to start a list like this off. The special occasion being I got through my first set of lists I wanted to do. I wanted to do best and worst lists for seasons 1 through 3 of SpongeBob specifically, and I succeeded at that with this video. And I'm very happy, so I decided just to celebrate and to open this video up, face reveal. So yeah, when I was originally making these lists, I just wanted to go through seasons 1 through 3 and maybe get to other seasons in the future. But now, I've decided that I do want to go seasons 4 and beyond. The reason why I was kind of struggling with what I wanted to do next for this particular series is just with all the drama and stuff that's been going on with SpongeBob and Nickelodeon as of recently, involving Camp Coral and the other spin-off series, it kind of pushed me away from wanting to talk about this show that I've wanted to talk about once I make a YouTube channel, just specifically because of what's going on right now. But I've decided that even with that drama, I still want to discuss the main series, at least up until a certain point, because it is really interesting to talk about, and good or bad, it is detached from all that drama later down the road. The spin-off series obviously is a completely different story, not watching those, but I will go up to the most recent season of current SpongeBob. Now, obviously, I love seasons 1 through 3 of SpongeBob. I think they're great classic seasons. Each season is great for similar reasons, but they all have their very own distinct flavors. They all have some amazing episodes, and they're all just consistently great because of how funny they are. SpongeBob is a comedy show first and foremost, and I think seasons 1 through 3 succeeds because they're just so funny. They're some of the funniest seasons of television. And I'm doing this list specifically in this format that I'm doing it in, because obviously, as I said in my season 1 list, that seasons 1 through 3 don't really have that many lackluster episodes. Those episodes are very few and in between, compared to just how many episodes from seasons 1 through 3 are absolutely amazing. And even between that, picking out episodes that I genuinely find bad is even harder. But I'm doing this list not only because I kind of want to set a standard of what was bad in post-movie SpongeBob. What was bad in pre-movie SpongeBob, and then going forward, seeing how that compares to the worst of post-movie SpongeBob, where most people agree the show starts to go downhill, or at least changes in a way where there's more bad episodes. Because starting at season 4, I will have enough material to do a worst list per season instead of a season block like this. And I also want to do this to show that even though I love these seasons, they're not flawless. They do have episodes that not only do I not like very much, but I think are bad. There are some bad episodes on this list, even if 2 of them are just okay. I do think, however, that the main issue that leads to most of the episodes on this list not being very good is the comedy not being very good. I think SpongeBob is a show that rides or dies on its comedy, above all else. Even if there are episodes that I think do more than just be funny and have amazing elements in them, which add to the overall experience, SpongeBob first and foremost is a comedy show throughout its entire run. And when the episode isn't funny, even when it has other interesting elements, usually those interesting elements aren't enough to sustain an episode in SpongeBob. Even something like Procrastination and Christmas Who, which I think are great for reasons that don't have a ton to do with comedy, I still think its comedy adds a lot. And if you remove the jokes from those 2 episodes, they fall apart. Luckily, in seasons 1 through 3, most of the episodes are really funny and are just incredibly laugh out loud hilarious. But there are certain episodes that are just lacking, whether the jokes don't work or whether there's a lack of jokes compared to other episodes. And in the case where some of the jokes don't work, remember, comedy is subjective, which makes this list a bit more personal and opinionated than some of my other lists. Sure, all my lists are opinionated, but this is one I could definitely see more people disagreeing with me on, because comedy is one of the most subjective things. God, I can't say subjective things there is. So if I don't find something funny and you do, just remember, this is my list, and I do love these seasons. And most of the episodes on this list, and honorable mentions included, aren't bad. They're just alright for that reason or another. And sure, certain episodes do have other problems, and maybe problems that are even bigger, but in most cases, if the comedy isn't good, that's what really hurts the episode in the end of the day. And the other big issue, and this gets bigger and bigger as the show goes on, and this is definitely more of a problem in season 3 than anything, but the show will try to tackle certain ideas that are way bigger than the show can handle, and they don't know how to use all their other elements around those ideas, which leads to the episodes just being a mess. This is more prone to season 3, which is way more comedy focused than ever, and they try to do very ambitious ideas like specials, and they just kind of fall flat. And this is a problem, both those problems, the lack of comedy or the comedy not being very good, or the show trying to take on ideas that are way too ambitious for its own good and not knowing how to handle them, are 2 problems that continually get worse and worse and worse as the show goes on. These problems are way bigger in post-movie SpongeBob, but in pre-movie SpongeBob, it does lead to certain episodes being lackluster. But I'm kind of spoiling the list, so let's just get into it. Here is my top 5 worst SpongeBob Seasons 1 through 3 episodes. Well, would you look at that? Starting this list off with a bang. I'm not quite sure if this episode is really that popular, but I know some people consider it to be a classic. And well, as I said earlier, my number 5 and 4 slots aren't bad, but I'm sorry, this episode is just leagues behind most of its contemporaries. Simply put, I just don't find this episode that funny. I know, what a shocker, but it's not for a lack of trying, and it's for different reasons than you might expect. The episode starts out promising enough. I love the Leif Erikson Day opening. It's one of the funniest SpongeBob jokes in history, and it's a very classic opening, and the best part of the episode. Also, him trying to think of a buddy to play with is decently funny, but it all goes downhill from there. Now, I've clearly shown that this episode does have good jokes, some of which I find very funny, but once Bubble Buddy enters the story, they only really tell one kind of joke over and over again. That being SpongeBob annoying people, pretending Bubble Buddy is alive. That's it. That's the joke. And it isn't really funny at all. You could say it's actually kind of annoying, in more ways than one. To be fair, they tell this joke in many different ways, and in many different places, like all the gags in the Krusty Krab, where Squidward has to make all these weird foods for Bubble Buddy, and all the different things SpongeBob does at Goo Lagoon, but it all leads to a very similar outcome. And I just don't find that outcome funny, no matter how many different ways they set it up. Yeah, Squidward is bending over backwards for Bubble Buddy, but it's not really fun to watch, and the punchline is SpongeBob doesn't pay him at the end, which comes off more as rude than funny. And the Goo Lagoon stuff isn't much better. Every joke is like that, and other than Shake That Bubble Butt, which is a little bit different and really funny, none of it is funny other than that. And along with being incredibly repetitive and once again annoying, SpongeBob is just so oblivious in this episode, and it's not fun to watch him do things like not pay Squidward for his hard work, or make people wait 2 hours to go to the bathroom, and even kill someone. Yeah, Scooter dies, though he did experience high tides. This episode has some funny moments, but a lot of it is just a repetitive joke that isn't really funny in the first place, and it kinda leaves a bad taste in my mouth. So when the people get together to pop the bubble, you're kinda cheering them on, because of how annoyed you are with SpongeBob in this entire episode, and how you want this shtick to end. And when they get to the scene where SpongeBob tries to talk about his special friend, I get it's supposed to be satirical, but after everything that's happened in this episode, and just how annoyed you've gotten, it doesn't work. And this leads me to the ending, which is without a doubt one of the worst in the original series, because any way you slice it, it doesn't make the episode better, and in one way, actually makes it worse. If Bubble Buddy was just a bubble the entire episode, it makes no sense, really even in a cartoony logic, how he came to life at the end, and it was just SpongeBob being inconsiderate to everyone. But if he was alive the entire episode, which the episode does imply, then Bubble Buddy has been a real jerk to all these people, which the episode tries to pass off as being funny jokes, which maybe could have worked if the jokes actually were funny, but they're not, so it just makes the episode even worse. So if I have such a big issue with the structure of this episode and the main joke it relies on, why isn't it any higher? Well, because this episode is more dull and mildly annoying most of the way through than anything. It's not extremely unfunny or hard to sit through, it's just got one major issue that brings the whole thing down, but even between that, there are still some really funny jokes, like in the beginning, and even just spread across the entire episode, there are a few really funny jokes, some great classic lines, and some mildly fun scenes on top of that, even if they're not that fun. And maybe I'm being a little nostalgia biased while saying this, but I think those little touches to the episode pushes it to be okay and not bad. Though it is close, and it definitely is the worst episode of Season 2. Which, hey, is more of a plus to that season that its worst episode is just a mildly okay one and not a bad one, if anything. Trust me, you can do much worse than mildly annoying and a little bit dull thanks to your running gag not being very funny. There are still some good things about this episode, which make it an alright watch, I guess. Though Bubble Buddy is still a lackluster episode overall, and it definitely earned a spot here. It's pretty mediocre, but as mediocre goes, there's another episode that I think is a bit worse. This is the other episode that isn't bad by any means, but it's pretty mediocre. And I do think this is worse than Bubble Buddy, if only by a little bit, because I just enjoy watching this one less, even if they have similar problems in a sense. But I can definitely say they also have similar things that I like about them. I like the opening and how they set up what the summertime is and what it means, and I like the playground scene, but once Mr. Krabs put his scheme into effect, that's when the episode starts to fall apart. The main joke of this episode is Mr. Krabs is cheap, and he's ripping off these children, and it's not a very good one. As the show goes on, going into the post-movie era, Mr. Krabs gets completely flanderized in most episodes to where him being cheap is his only personality trait. And while pre-movie SpongeBob doesn't really fall into this trap, there are some episodes where they play up his cheapness way too much, and this is the worst example. Majority of this episode is just him being cheap. From Krabby Land itself, to the point where he cares more about his windows than SpongeBob after he gets hurt, to Krabby the Clown, it's not funny and it's just really sad. He feels more like a one-note monster here, especially with that monologue at the end, which I know is supposed to be over the top, but it's just not funny. They don't play it in a way that's funny. It's just really sad and not fun to watch. It sucks Mr. Krabs is reduced to such a hollow shell of the character he usually is. And, well, yeah, as I said, it's nowhere near as bad as it can be in later seasons, because he still feels a bit more like his normal character, thanks to good writing in places, but it still sucks. And to be fair, this episode does try to get other jokes. SpongeBob hurting himself in more and more ridiculous ways to distract these kids is kind of funny, I guess, and some of the banter between these kids and the other characters is kind of funny, along with the dialogue in places just in general, and honestly, that's kinda it. The rest of the episode is just kinda setting up what summer is and Mr. Krabs' plan, him going through with that plan and walking off with the money at the end while they make Mr. Krabs' cheap jokes throughout the entire thing. And sure, he does get comeuppance at the end in a nice callback to something from earlier, but it doesn't really feel that satisfying and just feels like an easy way to end the episode. Once again, this episode isn't bad because there are certain parts of the episode I like and funny jokes here and there, and at the very least, they go really far with showing off how Mr. Krabs tries to be cheap with his scheme, and they try to tell jokes around his cheapness, which is a lot more than I can say for episodes later in the series, where it's literally just, haha, he's cheap, look how cheap he is. They actually try to get real jokes out of it at points, which is at least something I can give this episode credit for. So, this episode is like Bubble Buddy, as I said earlier, because it's just mildly annoying and dull more than anything. And while I don't find this episode funny, it's not terribly unfunny either, and I could see someone else enjoying these jokes, because once again, his cheapness is used to tell real jokes that I just don't find very funny. It's just not being fun to watch, along with some good things here and there, makes it pretty mediocre overall, and I think it is worse than Bubble Buddy because there's a bit less to redeem it, so it definitely deserves to be here. There's just not enough outright bad here, and enough redeeming qualities where I don't dislike the entire picture. The same cannot be said for the next 3 entries though. Alright, so here's the first episode that I don't like and consider to be bad. Now, to be fair, it's not that bad. It was very close to being in a similar category the last 2 episodes are in, for its minor problems. But there's one huge problem I just can't get past. Most of this episode is fine. I like the opening bit where they set up this snail race and why SpongeBob wants to make Gary join after Squidward insults Gary, and why Patrick decides to enter a rock. Both the rock jokes and Squidward's name getting pronounced wrong are fun running gags, even if they're very stupid and not the most well thought out ones. They still get a laugh out of me, and just the banter between our main characters is usual SpongeBob goodness, and is pretty funny at points here. I also like the joke where SpongeBob calls Gary a lady to insult him, and later gets rightfully punished by Sandy. It's a nice callback to the scene earlier in the episode, and it's probably the best part of the episode. So I do like an amount of this episode, even if I don't really like it that much, and it's definitely not as funny or well thought out as most other episodes, but it's still pretty serviceable. Though most of the episode is SpongeBob training Gary for this big race, and overall that's fine too. At first, it's just SpongeBob trying to get Gary to train and him not doing it in mildly amusing ways. But then it turns into a montage of Gary heavily training and slowly getting more and more overworked as SpongeBob doesn't notice, and it just makes him do more and more. It's not very fun to watch, but it's relatively quick, so it's not that bad. But this leads me into my big problem, the snail race itself. It starts out alright, with the I'm just a fan joke in the snail moving really slowly scene, which is kind of funny, but does go on a bit too long and just wasn't very well executed. But my big problem and what sinks this entire episode from being anything other than bad is the race itself. You can see Gary is in such pain, and SpongeBob shows no sympathy and is so awful to Gary in a really out-of-character way and pushes him to race when he physically can't, and he continually insults him throughout this entire thing. And he just keeps pushing and pushing him to do these things, and I know it's overplayed and that's supposed to be funny, but it's not. It's just sad and uncomfortable and really hard to watch. I'm not laughing because SpongeBob is being overly mean and pushy. I'm mad because I just want him to shut the hell up. And this scene gets even worse when he actually starts to get injured and blow up in a weird mechanical way, like he's some sort of car. And it's so stupid and hard to watch because of how much pain they put Gary in and how much they overplay it by making him this weird machine. To be fair, SpongeBob does try to redeem himself at this point and backs off a bit, but it doesn't make up for how awful and misguided this 2-minute scene is that serves as our climax. While it isn't the most hard thing to watch, and it isn't the worst scene ever, and wasn't enough to drop this episode down any further, honestly, it is the worst scene in pre-movie SpongeBob. It really is that bad. And while I do like an amount of things here, I don't really love anything. Sure, The Rock winning in the end is kind of funny, even though it is pretty predictable, and there's some good jokes and little moments throughout, but overall, it's already a pretty lackluster episode as it is, so that awful scene is enough to taint the entire thing for me. But it's still only number 3 because there are episodes I enjoy watching overall much less and have even less positive things to say about them. Hell, this isn't even the worst episode of Season 3, because at least it only wasted 11 minutes of my time. This is the worst episode of Season 3. Even though I love Season 3, it is definitely the most hit or miss season, with its highs being extremely high, but also having a lot of episodes that I'm not very fond of. And this is the worst one. And it's the only special on the list. And let me clarify that no, it's not here because it's a special. I do enjoy this episode less than The Great Snail Race for many different reasons, and it being a special doesn't help it much, but that's not the main reason it's here. I guess I'll dive into that aspect first. Season 3 tries to do 3 different specials after Christmas Who turned out so successful. And while Shanghai, in its current form that most people watch it in, is not a 22-minute special, it's still a pseudo-special, and a very great one at that. All 3 of the Season 3 specials, though, in my opinion, aren't very good. and are good examples of some of the biggest problems with not only Season 3, but SpongeBob in general, and really shows going forward 2 things. The first being that if an episode isn't funny, it usually fails, because most of the time, there's not much to fall back on, even if they try interesting ideas. And the second being, SpongeBob is a show made for the 11-minute format. A lot of the time, the writers have no idea how to tell a bigger story using this extra time of the 22-minute format, while at the same time telling good jokes. So on both ends, the episode suffers. While I'm not a big fan of Ugg or The Sponge Who Could Fly, for those reasons, and I will be talking about them soon, there are a lot of things about those episodes I like and admire. Also, I at least get why those were turned into specials. Party Pooper Pants, on the other hand, not so much. This episode has pretty much zero substance, even for an episode of SpongeBob. Having an episode about SpongeBob throwing a party be a 22-minute special was a terrible idea, and feels so gimmicky. And sure enough, this was hyped up as a big event for Nickelodeon, so that's exactly what it is, a gimmick and a marketing trap. And that's what the episode feels like. There's no reason why this couldn't have been 11 minutes. It would have been way better and made much more sense if it was. But as it stands, this is just a boring episode that isn't very funny and is really annoying in places. While the scene in the Great Snail Race is the worst, this episode is definitely SpongeBob's worst appearance in seasons 1 through 3. He is insufferable here. The episode follows him throwing a lame house party, and when people try to have fun, he is just a buzzkill the entire time. That's the entire episode. While there are some funny, weird jokes sprinkled in, I don't know how that happened. Most of it is just SpongeBob being uptight about how he wants to run his lame party that no one is enjoying, and it's just obnoxious, to the point where when he gets locked out of his house and arrested for stupid reasons, I'm happy. Honestly, why does SpongeBob care so much about making this party perfect, that he's oblivious to the fact that everyone's having fun? This feels more in line with Squidward than anything, but that's really all the episode is. When it's not being boring, it's just stupid because of how annoying SpongeBob is. And it's made so much worse because of how dragged out it all is due to being double length. I'm not sure if this episode would have been great being 11 minutes. There are story issues you need to fix, but it would be so much better because this is just a story that fits the 11-minute format so much more. And even though there's not a ton of jokes as it is, the 11-minute format would have made it so that joke amount was at least a bit more understandable. But as it stands, this episode is just long and bloated and not very funny, and the lack of jokes just shows so much more, and the problems just get so much worse. And because there's so little substance as it stands, the episode is just so bad. Because the rest of the episode is a long setup to this party that's just boring. The dumb scenes I mentioned earlier, SpongeBob getting arrested, which makes no sense, but who cares? And then him realizing the party was actually a success, which is such a lame way to end the episode because we already knew this. SpongeBob didn't know this because he was so ignorant, but as I said earlier, there's no reason for him to be. And in between all of this, we have the worst patchy segments in seasons 1 through 3. All the charm from Christmas Who is gone, and it's replaced with lame jokes, not in a cheesy way that sets atmosphere and parodies a low-budget educational show in a charming way. No, it's just lame and stupid and not funny. And what's even more surprising is that the patchy segments are the best parts of the other 2 specials in season 3. So why are they so dumb here? I honestly don't know. And I'll wrap this segment up with that. This episode is a bloated, gimmicky mess that is simultaneously really boring and really obnoxious. with bad, patchy segments in between it all, with only a few good jokes and some good atmosphere, surprisingly enough, in places, but that only brings it up so much. So, it's no wonder why I don't like this episode, and it's this high. But why isn't it number 1? Well, it was really close. This is such a bad episode, and there is so little redeemable here, and the fact that it's longer than any of the other episodes on this list made me feel like it deserves more scorn for taking up more of my time and being so much worse than its contemporaries. But what just kept it from reaching that top spot was Underwater Sun, which is a great song, maybe one of SpongeBob's best, and is such a fun scene, and ends such a bad episode on a great note. It doesn't redeem this episode at all, but my number 1 doesn't have anything that good in it, and is even worse overall. So this only landed at number 2, even if it was extremely close. But before we get into what was worse than Party Pooper Pants, here are 9 honorable mentions. Once again, none of these are bad, but they are episodes that are weaker than most from the first 3 seasons, and I want to discuss them because of that. This episode is okay. It's pretty evenly split with things I like and don't like. On the one hand, I like this setup and the premise, but the jokes are so 50-50 with me throughout the entire thing. Some of it isn't very funny and kind of repetitive, but other jokes are really funny. And this may come back to the fact, while I like the concept, it isn't that good. It's an alright concept. And while I like the scene where Squidward reveals himself, I think the ending is really stupid. Overall, I'm leaning a bit more towards liking this one, but it's still very mixed when I at least really like what most of the other episodes have to offer. This is another episode I'm very mixed on. Once again, I like the setup and the general concept, even if it's not very strong. Once they get to prom, I find some jokes really funny, but others just fall flat. The main shtick of this episode is Pearl being embarrassed by SpongeBob and just trying to get him to act more to her standards at this prom, and it could really work, and in places it does, but a lot of it just falls flat because they don't do very much with it. What really hurts this episode, though, is the teenage satire just isn't very good, and the SpongeBob breakdown scene feels very out of place for this episode, even if it is built up to. Yeah, Do the SpongeBob is really funny, but it's a little too over the top for my liking. And the ending is really stupid. It just makes no sense. Overall, I like more here than I dislike because of some good jokes, cool atmosphere, and great character interactions in places, especially between SpongeBob and Pearl near the end, even if it's kind of ruined due to the ending, but it's still a very hit or miss episode. This is the last Season 1 episode that made the honorable mentions, and it falls into the same category the last two did in a lot of similar ways. The setup and general concept are good and pretty funny, even if the setup is a bit dragged out and the concept isn't great. The actual competition itself is very hit or miss when it comes to gags, and the ending is kinda dumb. Once again, I think the good jokes and bits here definitely lean the episode more towards me liking it, but it's still just okay. Now this is an episode I feel 100% down the middle on. On the one hand, I like the opening, I think it's cute. SpongeBob preparing with Patrick to be manly is fun. Him trying to act that way during Patrick's nonsense is amusing in places. And I like the ending message a lot and appreciate it for being a bit more interesting than you might expect an episode like this with this subject matter to be. But I hate how mean the fish are to SpongeBob. even as a setup to this plot, it's just way too mean-spirited and feels really unjustified. I also think Patrick is really annoying here. Sure, him doing what he is doing isn't out of character, but it's not fun to watch him be this naive and so easily take SpongeBob's place while being a jerk doing it. And why does his grandma even pamper him? And these scenes just go on way too long. Also, SpongeBob's freakout at the end does feel out of character and is so overblown. And even if I like the ending message, it's kind of undermined when we have to have these fish get one last jab at SpongeBob. So really no element overpowers the other to push the episode one way or the other. So overall, I just feel exactly down the middle on it. Boring. Decently funny in places, but a lot of it is just really boring and very melodramatic, which isn't that bad because they do some interesting stuff with it, I guess, but they still don't do enough with this story to justify just how melodramatic the entire thing is. But then again, there aren't a ton of jokes here anyways, and the jokes aren't really that good. This episode was definitely close to making the list, but I think it is a bit more well-rounded than something like Bubble Buddy, so it was just spared, but overall, it's just meh. Another meh episode. The opening is funny. I like the commercial itself, but I think the concept is just kinda dumb. Though they do get some funny jokes out of it, like the striped sweater song, a lot of it is just dull and not very interesting. I don't think this plot really fits SpongeBob that well. It doesn't go a lot of interesting places, and I really don't like this ending. It just feels very lazy and kind of like a cop-out in a sense. I think if they were gonna go with the story, they could have done more interesting things with it, told more jokes, and just done a more interesting ending. So overall, not very good, but it's still far from bad. I told you I'd talk about the other specials. I'll give this episode this. It makes sense why something like this would be a special, being a bit more higher concept, at least how it presents itself, even if they don't do that much with it. And I love the patchy stuff here, but the actual SpongeBob segment itself is so lacking. Imagine Reef Blower, but way longer. That to an extent is this episode, and I respect the fact that they were able to tell a story with fun visual gags in places like this with very little dialogue, but Reef Blower works because it's a short. This is longer than the normal SpongeBob episode and doesn't have any of the great word-based humor most of those episodes have. And the episode just isn't that interesting because it's so simple and the visual gags just aren't that funny. It's mildly entertaining, but I definitely know why this episode is called SpongeBob Before Comedy. Once again, the patchy stuff brings the episode up a lot, but even still, it's not that good. This is the other episode that makes Mr. Krabs way too cheap. But I like this one much more than Krabby Land. The setup with the gross Krabby Patty is hit or miss, but I like the concept of Mr. Krabs trying to be generous, and while it doesn't lead to many interesting things, we still get a lot of funny jokes and some interesting character insight. Though this episode is still pretty dull in places because of lack of jokes overall, and it is all over the place, which leads into the terrible scene of Mr. Krabs giving away SpongeBob for a tiny amount of money, and it's just so out of character. But then the Flying Dutchman just gives him right back and drops the punishments he was originally gonna give to Mr. Krabs, which really makes no sense, so it just makes this episode feel meaningless. Still, it's not bad because it is funny and interesting in places, but it's still meaningless and not very fun to watch nonetheless. The last Season 3 special and the last honorable mention. Same with UGG, I really like the Patchy stuff here. Heck, this might be the best Patchy segments in Season 3. I think it's really over the top, but funny because of how many different things they do with these segments. But it's the SpongeBob portions, yet again, that let this episode down. Unlike Ugg, where I understand why they made it a special, even if I think it was the wrong choice, here I have a lot less of an idea. Yes, I get the gimmick of it being a lost episode, but the actual plot itself doesn't really lend itself to a 22-minute special, and that shows right away. It's just a boring episode about SpongeBob wanting to fly. It's too long and lacking in jokes, with just not a lot of substance. Sure, there's some funny bits and a few good songs, but this would have probably made the list for just how bloated it is if it wasn't for the Patchy segments bringing it all up. But with that out of the way, let's finish this list and finally get into what is the worst episode of SpongeBob from seasons 1 through 3. The worst episode of Season 1, and easily one of the worst of the series. There is so little good here, and most of the episode is just atrocious. Let's start at the beginning. We start off with a really slow opening, setting up that SpongeBob and Patrick are going to this jellyfish convention, while SpongeBob tries to convince Squidward to watch Gary. Once he actually convinces him, he shows him what to do while taking care of him. And I gotta say, this whole opening is so slow and takes up way too much time. The dialogue is really clunky and awkward in a way that I can't quite explain, but it is because of just how slow this opening is, and it's really noticeable compared to the rest of the episodes in Season 1, and all the jokes just kinda fall flat. But when SpongeBob and Patrick leave for the convention, you're kind of wishing that that would be the plot of the episode. But no, we stay with Squidward watching Gary. And it goes exactly where you would expect. The episode sets this plot up like Squidward will watch Gary just so he can get SpongeBob and Patrick to leave so he can spend the weekend by himself, so it's not surprising when something bad happens. And the scene where Squidward tries to force-feed sick Gary, who he hasn't fed or paid attention to in these past couple of days, right before SpongeBob comes home to try to cover this all up, is played for laughs, but it's just not funny and is really sad. And maybe you might be saying, well, they're actually trying to tell a serious story, but it doesn't work for reasons I'll get into, ignoring the fact that this scene is definitely played in a comedic way. When SpongeBob figures out and he and Squidward call the doctor gives him snail plasma to make Gary better. And while this could have been a very serious scene, they play it very comedically, because the doctor doesn't actually explain what's wrong with Gary. We're just left to assume it's because he's hungry, but I don't really know because this episode is so badly paced. And he gives SpongeBob the snail plasma and walks off because he's too squeamish to actually give Gary the plasma himself. And this is one of the biggest issues of the episode, because not only is it not very funny and pretty awkward all around, they do such a bad job at balancing the comedy and story. It's hard to know if I'm supposed to take this story seriously with all these weird jokes and loose ends, which is weird, because at least pre-movie SpongeBob usually doesn't have a problem with this. And this is a problem that sinks every single part of this episode, and along with being a very slow and dry experience, it makes it really hard to get into any aspect of it. But after the only funny scene in the episode, where Squidward is trying to give Gary the shot, but SpongeBob keeps getting in the way and accidentally gets hit himself, which is funny because it's actually well-timed, unlike everything else here. But then Gary becomes better by just drinking water. So was the snail plasma unnecessary? Why did the episode act like it was because he hadn't eaten in a while? Nothing about this makes any sense because of how all over the place and underdeveloped this episode is. And as I said, these weird moments that make the story just make no sense and are played for comedy but don't work because they're not funny and they ruin the story. And they just hurt this episode on whole and make it hard to take seriously. So this episode is a mess and really strange, but not in an interesting way, though it gets even weirder. In a way that makes even less sense. After the Gary being sick plot just kinda ends, as I said, SpongeBob, in a really slow and drawn out way, becomes a snail because he was injected with snail plasma. Why does this happen? Why would the snail plasma do this? I have no idea, because the episode doesn't explain this at all, because the episode doesn't explain a lot of things. The scene is just so weird and awkward, and while the actual transformation itself does look kinda cool from an animation standpoint, the whole scene just makes no sense. And then he goes to Squidward's house, and Squidward gets scared, but I can't tell what SpongeBob is trying to accomplish here. Is he trying to annoy Squidward, scare him, stalk him, just say hi, make him feel bad for accidentally injecting him with snail plasma? I have no idea, and these last two scenes are a culmination of all the episode's problems, because not only are they badly paced, but they make no sense. Also, what's really the point? Are they trying to punish Squidward? If that's it, what's the point? Squidward already made up for his bad actions when he tried to help Gary. Unless that's not what they're doing, I really don't know. And instead of trying to make the scene, I don't know, interesting, or maybe even kind of intense, it's just Squidward running back and forth for part of it, and then it cuts to his house moving back and forth. They make the scene even less interesting, which ends the episode on one of the most awkward notes ever, where Squidward gets injected with the shot, becomes a snail, and him, SpongeBob, and Gary all sing a song, with Squidward getting hit by a shoe. What? So this episode's a mess. It's all over the place, makes no sense, isn't funny, had no idea what it wants to do with any of its elements. It's so predictable in the first half and so nonsensical in the second. It's just so awkward and poorly paced and is boring while simultaneously being a frustrating experience because of just how stupid it is from beginning to end, with so little thought put into it with how this episode should function. It is fundamentally broken and is worse than Party Pooper Pants because I enjoy watching it less for how stupid it is, and there is far less redeeming. There is one joke I like and a kind of cool moment, and that's it. So let me say it here. This is without a doubt the worst episode in the first 3 seasons, and one of the worst SpongeBob episodes in general. It makes no sense how even in season 1, which is rough in some places, but still a great season with so many amazing episodes, there is an episode that is this broken in every single way. Nothing else in seasons 1 through 3 was anywhere near as bad, which granted this episode the #1 spot on this list. And with that, making lists on pre-first movie SpongeBob is done. This has been a lot of fun, talking about the good and bad of 3 amazing seasons that mean a lot to me. I look forward to talking about post-first movie SpongeBob and many other shows in the future. So as usual, if you enjoyed this, please leave a like and subscribe for more content similar to this in the future. Also, leave a comment telling me what you thought of my list and what your own list would have been. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Sorry the images in the #1 section were kinda crummy. That's all the SpongeBob Wiki had. But hey, be happy I got this video out so fast. And on that note, special thanks to the SpongeBob Wiki, because that's where I got all the images for this video from. And with that said, I'm going to be taking a little break from SpongeBob, and the next list will be the top 5 best Simpsons Season 5 episodes, which will be coming near the end of March. And April will be a month dedicated to Hey Arnold, where I will do the top 5 best Hey Arnold Season 3 episodes list, and the top 5 worst Hey Arnold Seasons 1 through 3 episodes list. So a lot of fun stuff is coming up. So until then, this is Chocolate Guy, signing off. Take care.